On October 25th, Nintendo released their expansion pack for the Nintendo Switch Online service, and it came included with both Nintendo 64 and Sega Genesis. But today, I wanted to focus on the N64 service, and discuss the emulation, the good and the bad, and the future of this service. High level, it works, but as you begin to dig in, or if you are familiar with Nintendo 64 emulators, visible problems start to appear. And for an extra $30 a year, is it really worth your time and money? Today's episode is brought to you by Displate. Displate is a one-of-a-kind metal poster that's been designed to capture unique creativity and passions. They are really cool metal prints that are sturdy and easily magnet mounted and will last you a long time. Now, before I jump in and grab a sponsor, I first have to try out the product. So I ended up ordering a couple myself. I'm going to show you how cool they are and how easy it is to set one up. As a huge fan of Bloodborne on the PlayStation, Displate had me covered, offering really great selections of Bloodborne-style artwork. In fact, there's so many different categories that you can choose from. There's literally hundreds of thousands of prints made by artists and some really great collections. Now, once you get your Displate, you'll notice how well it really pops on metal. And on the back will be simple instructions on how to mount these posters. Mounting is really simple and takes around 30 seconds. First, wipe down the area of the wall with a cleaning wipe, then stick on the protective leaf on the wall, and then press the magnet onto the area for about 5 seconds. And that's it, you're all done. Your poster can be easily mounted on your wall. Now, Displate has some really awesome video game artwork that you can purchase and check out for yourself. They ship fast, and for a limited time, if you buy 1 or 2 Displates, you'll receive 26% off your order. And if you buy 3 or more, you'll receive 36% off. You just need to click on the affiliate link in the description below. Once again, big thanks to Displate for sponsoring today's episode. When it comes to emulating the Nintendo 64, it's not a simple topic to discuss. N64 emulation has been around since 1999, where Reality Man and Epsilon infamously delivered Ultra HLE, a Nintendo 64 emulator that ran on Pentium 2 class machines with a 3D Effects Voodoo card. The results were incredible for the time, and the sky was the limit. The problem, however, with Ultra HLE is, as the name suggests, HLE or high-level emulation is used to replace C-level functions with equivalent emulated ones. While initially performance and the results are impressive, it breaks down because Nintendo 64 has an interesting underlying architecture. Programmable microcode, RD RAM, small texture memory, just to name a few. Emulating the N64 in this fashion would be very difficult. But Ultra HLE was 1999, and over the years Nintendo 64 emulation has undergone many iterations and enhancements, and these days many popular emulators such as Mupen Plus 64, BizHawk, Project 64, and Parallel 64 are easily accessible on your PC, phone, modded game console, and even Raspberry Pi, and in general they run very well. So with that all said, let's turn our attention to Nintendo 64 emulation on the Nintendo Switch. This emulation is internally developed by Nintendo, and we expect at least parity with community developed efforts. And while generally good, unfortunately what's been offered, at least on this first iteration, falls short in some areas. According to data miners, the emulator that's being used is the exact same one that powers Super Mario 64 in the Mario 3D All-Star Collection. The codename is known as Hovercraft, and it renders its graphics using Vulkan on the Switch. Much in the same way as Super Mario 64 on the 3D Collection, it uses Lua scripting to apply patches. These patches are game specific and perform various tasks. For example, in Ocarina of Time, a patch is used when killing enemies to display only 1 white flash instead of 3. This is clearly for accessibility reasons. When you first run the N64 games under the NSO, initial impressions are quite good, and for the majority of people, this will be good enough. One of the very first things I decided to check for was how the emulator handled frame buffer emulation. The N64 has an architecture where both the CPU and GPU, known as the Reality Display Processor, share the same RAM. This means the frame buffer on original hardware can be manipulated on the fly, but on emulation, a copy of the frame buffer must be supplied, and then the appropriate effects applied to that frame buffer, and then copied over the bus to video memory to be rendered. This process can be quite CPU intensive. If we take a look at Mario Kart 64, the Jumbotron is one of the more popular areas where you can see the frame buffer effects in play. The results here are positive. Nintendo did a good job handling all frame buffer emulation effects that I can see. Mario Tennis is another notable title that has many different frame buffer effects, and all of them are implemented correctly. Another area where Nintendo did a good job was texture upscaling and filtering. This can be especially noticeable in some emulators when upscaling resolutions. This can lead to texture misalignment and bias issues. For the most part, the emulator does the job, but there are still some issues that I'd like to point out. When textures are filtered on any modern GPU, 4 sample points are used, but on the Nintendo 64 it uses 3 sample points, and unfortunately, it does not appear that the N64 implementation here uses 3 sample points. And this can be very easily demonstrated if we take a look at the character select screen on Mario Kart 64. You can clearly see the lines where the textures are stitched together. And if we compare that with a popular Nintendo 64 emulator known as Project 64, with the 3-point filtering option applied, it's completely eliminated. 3-point filtering emulation certainly has a cost associated to it, so it's likely that Nintendo omitted this for performance reasons. Another area that I want to touch on is input lag. The reuse of an internally developed emulator is no surprise. So one of the tests that I did was to load up Mario 64 on the NSO and compare that to Mario 64 on 3D All-Stars. And one thing that I noticed is that Mario 64 on the NSO has at least 2 additional frames of input lag. This was an apples to apples comparison of simple jumping with attached Joy-Cons in handheld mode. Now certainly 1 or 2 more frames is not really a huge deal to the average person, but to speedrunners it's more noticeable. Now speaking of input lag, let's take a look at Ocarina of Time. This is one of the games that has had quite a bit of attention. So for this I decided to set up my own tests. Now keep in mind, I certainly don't possess the appropriate equipment to capture input lag, and I'll leave that up to the experts. But for me, this is noticeable enough to be distracting in some instances. For this test, I did a simple backflip with an OLED switch with attached Joy-Cons in handheld mode, eliminating as much controller lag as possible. I then compared that by hooking up my Nintendo 64 to my LCD, which I had put into game mode, connected up via a RetroTink 5X Pro. Now of course, I could have used a CRT to completely blow the doors off the emulation, but I wanted to keep this a fair fight, and you can see the difference. And just for giggles, I turned on my Xbox Series X and loaded up Movement Plus 64 on that, and connected it up to the exact same LCD screen. And you can see that it has a much more acceptable level of input lag. Now the good news here is that input lag seems to be game specific. For example, when I tried Star Fox 64 or Mario Tennis, the input lag was a lot better. Now, input lag is one thing, but another area where the emulation really does suffer is its implementation of fog rendering. In Ocarina of Time, from the moment that I saw the title screen, I knew something fell off. The use of fog is an integral part of the game and something that really sets the mood. Fog rendering in Ocarina of Time is completely broken. Essentially what we have here is almost the inverse of what the game should be doing. In Kokoriki Village at the beginning of the game on real hardware, there should be no fog up close, yet we see it on the emulated NSO version. Now this may be a subtle thing, but the problem is in scenarios where we expect fog to be rendered at distance, it's completely missing. And this is the root cause of many of the screenshots that you've probably already seen floating around on Twitter and on various websites. At this point, I'm unsure as to how this game actually got through QA, because this is something that would have been picked up pretty quickly. It's certainly possible that fog rendering could have been scaled back in order to increase performance. But then I have to wonder, there's been homebrew versions of N64 emulators running on the Switch literally for the last 4 years. So it's hard for me to believe that the Switch hardware is not capable of applying fog rendering in the appropriate way. Once again, I do hope that Nintendo takes a look at this and patches it in an up-and-coming version. The online netcode for N64 NSO is also quite poor, and you'll be seeing this happen a lot. The reasons are simply because the code uses a lockstep method where each player must be in perfect sync with each other, one sync error, and the emulation pauses so the other players can catch up, and this really becomes distracting. I ran some 3 and 4 player tests online, and note I'm using a wired Ethernet connection from my OLED switch dock using fiber internet. But unfortunately, the problem here is whoever has the weakest connection will bring the rest down. So if you are going to play online, be mindful of your connection quality. There were occasions of a good multiplayer experience, but this was the exception rather than the rule. And I have already discussed my thoughts about Nintendo doing little to nothing to address their online multiplayer infrastructure, and yet charging additional money for N64 and a so-called premium service. Yes, playing online games with your friends is cool, but the novelty wears off quickly, and it becomes a laggy mess of gameplay. Very disappointing, considering Mario Kart 64 Online really could have been something special. Okay, so where does Nintendo go from here? Well, one thing is certain, that the service will continue to evolve. We already know that more games will be added at a later date, and data miners have found additional slots for as much as up to 38 games on the service. This means that hopefully we will see enhancements and bug fixes coming in to address some of these concerns. At least I'd like to think so. Incoming games like F-Zero and Paper Mario require attention to detail to emulate properly, and it will be interesting to see how these fare. But at the end of the day, here are my thoughts. As a casual player, you'll likely be satisfied with the service, and you won't even notice any of the issues that I've brought up. And that's awesome. I've never been one to tell people how to spend their money or enjoy themselves. Unfortunately, for those of us who grew up with Nintendo 64, or have been using N64 emulators over the years, and certainly those folks who like to speedrun games, you'll likely be very disappointed in what Nintendo has brought to the table. In conclusion, Nintendo 64 on the NSO Expansion Pack simply isn't very good, and for me, this is the most disappointing aspect. I would have expected at least a level of quality to match, and note I said match, that of a modern N64 emulator. I'm not expecting HD texture packs, or 60 FPS patches or widescreen, just a user experience to play Nintendo 64 games the way that they were meant to be played. Unfortunately, what we have here is something of a lower standard, and yes, while I'm hopeful that Nintendo will address some of these concerns, at this time, your best option is to stick with your phone, Raspberry Pi, PC, modded console, or whatever, and enjoy a much better community-based Nintendo 64 emulator out there. But that will do it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts about the N64 emulation for the Nintendo Switch Online service. I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say on this. But for now, we are going to leave it here. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this episode, don't forget to put a like on it, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.